If you're not documented, if you're not visible, if you're not loud about it, you don't exist. These are the words of one Victoria Hoffmo, taken from a New York One article about the hidden Norwegian history of the Brooklyn neighborhood called Bay Ridge. If you're not documented and visible, you're basically a ghost. Norway, mostly its ghosts, has been entwined in my life in subtle ways which were easy to ignore. Growing up in Bay Ridge and hearing names like Leif Erikson Park or Bergen Place meant as little to me as calling a street 3rd Avenue or Shore Road. These were just names. Once I began to examine the history of this place and finally pay attention, I found the synchronicity, the compounding coincidence, to be piling up. But was I noticing this way too late? As more time passed, Scandinavian businesses like Nordic Delicacies and Leski's Bakery were closed down and replaced with contemporary hotspots. If things continue the way they are over time, South Brooklyn would soon resemble the corpo-laden strip malls of America, though not without some resistance. There are bars like the Leaf and Soccer Tavern, which continue to doggedly hold on as of the recording of this video. Throughout the year, these establishments are standard pubs, but they do come to life during the month of May, which we'll talk about more later. Leif Erikson Park still stands as an homage to the Scandinavian explorer who first discovered America over a millennia ago. These were more than names. These were instead the last visible celebrations of a culture that came to South Brooklyn, helped reshape it, became hidden over time, and ultimately resonated with my life. And the nearby Norwegian Americans continue to don shirts and proudly proclaim, "Leif landed first." How much more did I find to be reminiscent of Brooklyn when I visited Oslo? From mass transit coverage, to avenues with mixed density buildings, to parks filled with wildlife, to parades and protests both abroad and at home.
I don't know if this comes through in the camera, but this man is like 6'9".
Let's take a closer look together and untangle the connections. This is Norway Theory. Why? Why am I even talking about this? Instead of burying the lead, I'll simply say that this whole project was inspired by the connections between myself and the land of the midnight sun. It may be more accurate to say that I was searching for significance to the area I was raised, Bay Ridge. While dense, it is quite close to feeling like a town nestled in the corner of the Narrows, one half of the gateway to the Hudson River. Of course, the large apartment buildings and wide avenues don't exactly scream American suburb, but the neighborhood is dominated by a boundary of highways and their daily din of traffic. These expressways almost make a wall which separates the area proper from Sunset Park to the north and Decker Heights to the east. It's possible to cross, but only via a few thoroughfares, which are often congested with vehicles. A few smaller privately owned stores line the commercial byways, and large corporate chains struggle to saturate the area like it does in other parts of the boroughs. That is not to say that no corporate presence exists, only that massive chains like Starbucks have a little bit of a harder time penetrating here. Parks are abundant, with Shore Road Park offering charming views of the bridge, the harbor, and the ocean beyond, not to mention the city as well. But all that is to say that while Bay Ridge is a comfortable kind of town, it's also a bit dull in its day-to-day. Unless your hobbies are drinking at one of the many pubs or eating, then you'll be in for a lot of repetition. That's not a bad thing at all, as there is a certain kind of comfort in predictability and roughly knowing what you're going to get, what you pay for. However, this does not exactly impose upon you with its own character. Instead, you would have to engage with the historical elements of the neighborhood. You discover all the troubles a place has faced, how it's adapted, and why it looks the way it does. Besides expansive and hilly parks, the seaside inclination of both South Brooklyn and Oslo, robust culture, ever-shifting demographics, the stories of the people itself, it feels so referential, and it's so easy for me to relish in these vibes. That's mainly surface level though. Truth be told, you'd be hard-pressed to find the remaining Norwegian Americans located in South Brooklyn. And yet this area once represented an enclave of roughly 5,500 people. Direct immigration from Norway was severely curtailed by the US Immigration Act of 1924. So by the late 1950s, this enclave would have mostly been first and second generation folks. Things have really shifted since then. The reported number now is something like 6,000 people according to the latest census data. And that remnant feels so spread out in the area that running into a Norwegian flag or a reference to Scandinavian history in the wild feels like coming across an Easter egg. And yeah, I stumbled across those connections in a coincidental way. Not because I can claim any sort of direct historical tie with Oslo or Norway, or that I'm seeking to cosplay as a Viking in the second half of my life in some kind of midlife crisis thing. No, the exposure came from growing a relationship with my wife, whose family emigrated from southern Norway in the early 20th century, as so many Norse folks had done at the time. Through conversations with her grandmother and grandaunt, along with being regaled with stories about her great-grandmother, I was able to steal a glimpse into the life of Bay Ridge during the Depression era and the Second World War. The Norwegian enclave is based out of a place called Lobsgass Boulevard, a colloquial name for a stretch of streets that spread down 8th Avenue. This stronghold had persisted until the late 1950s, and then a certain individual had come along and decided to be a real power broker. Who was that again? Robert Moses. Holy shit. I mean, who else was gonna build that stuff back then? But I don't know, but he did it so bad, and I don't know. Modernity often requires sacrifice, and just like the displacement that occurred elsewhere in New York City, this area was also a victim of improvement. Ugh, din jävla! The website Segregation by Design offers a unique look at the massive changes caused by the construction of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. A video featured on the site shows a comparison between 1924 and 1984, with the most drastic part of the project, which extended the Iguanas portion of the highway and built the Verrazano Bridge, occurring in the 50s and early 60s. Here's how that website shows it. Overall, the resulting project that Brooklyn has today was rife with issues and accusations of corruption before the groundbreaking. Not much has changed in that way. And it came on the heels of a failed proposal for a rail and car tunnel roughly around the area that the bridge occupies now. Not to mention an alternate version of the expressway that would have flanked along the shoreline, much like the Belt Parkway does today. However, the city decided to go with the old last-minute tactical bomb switcheroo in 1958, and instead sent the highway up the guts of Bay Ridge and the titular Lobsgass Boulevard. This displaced something in the region of 7,500 families of South Brooklyn. The feeling of the era was best surmised in Leonard Bernardo's book, Brooklyn by Name. Quote, during the 20th century Scandinavian heyday, when scores of buildings were being destroyed in the early 60s to make way for the Verrazano Bridge, a long-standing resident lamented that it knocked out the heart of the Norwegian community. Unquote. I'm not sure if the original proposals would have ultimately been better for the environment, or if Lobsgass Boulevard would be still thriving today, had the plan to follow along the shoreline been seen through. Maybe the current intercity layout was truly the best and cheapest option that the city could feasibly come up with. Considering how the route looks like it's rotting in places today and the snarling congestion ensures that this is a slow way of transporting goods and people into the city's core, I have my doubts. It could have been a lot worse though. Old Mo would have preferred to have 6 lanes in either direction had he fully gotten his way. That's 12 total lanes. And besides, it's not like New York City had any more dramatic highway designs in store for its future after the BQE project. Wait, what did they do in the Bronx? Oh, madre de Dios, no. South Brooklyn used to have a crisscrossing network of streetcars during the height of the Norwegian enclave. Some of my earlier memories of the area were of the old trolley tracks that would run up 5th Avenue, which were constantly paved over since the more temperamental asphalt would wear down and swell and crack to reveal twin beams of steel. At the time, it was most likely determined that the cheapest option forward after abandoning the streetcar trolley was to bury it, sort of like burying an inconvenient memory. Perhaps there is some credit to the General Motors streetcar conspiracy of killing off a viable form of local mass transit to encourage the use of tires, oil, and pavement. Or it really was a means of conveyance that had to go the way of the dodo. What I can see is that both cities, Oslo and New York City, namely Brooklyn, were urban areas that were built with trolley cars somewhat in mind. Now, one city has multiple forms of mass transit, which help keep its roads light on traffic, encouraging people to commute by foot, while the other city has to contend with a massive layer of daily traffic snarls, an immense amount of noise, and not to mention increased pollution, and of course there's always noise pollution, walking conditions, collisions, commute times to get to quality subway, mass transit vehicles, and garbage in my soul. Remember, Brooklyn and NYC is supposed to be a high watermark and lucky place to be if you desire mass transit options. It's true, I have to agree that some form of alternative to having to drive is better than no option whatsoever. This isn't an urban design or infrastructure critique channel yet, since I'm about 6 degrees from being an expert on that topic. Maybe I should take it easy and just go with the tourism angle instead, talking about the food and stuff like that.
In Norway, and in Oslo specifically, they're very conscientious of your health, so they make you walk up all these stairs.
Even in the early 90s, the feel of South Brooklyn was shifting over as families moved out and new demographics replaced them. Visiting Oslo for a few weeks was like returning to an earlier time in Brooklyn. And perhaps this could be seen as an incorrect perception, and sure, I was probably wearing some kind of rose-tinted goggles. It's all fantasy relating to how Brooklyn was. But Oslo felt more fun, safer, with less hostility from strangers, with more people walking out. It was active, noisy, lively. People were just talking and not snarled in traffic jams and honking. It's not all double-parked trucks. Essentially, the Brooklyn of my youth wasn't so dominated by the noise of street traffic, and it was more taken up with the sound of people. Oslo in parts is still like that. This is probably an unfair comparison, and it probably has more to do with where exactly I live and how I engage with Brooklyn. In your day-to-day, American life seems to focus or revolve around the ideas of ancestry and heraldry as a kind of attribute. Typically, these concepts are bantered about in a casual way. It could very well be that I only notice it so much because it's a point of great personal annoyance. So many conversations meander to whatever brand of hyphenated Americanism a person here carries with them. Possibly it's a result of diversity within America, and specifically within New York City, which becomes exhausting through repetition. It's like having too many types of fruit to eat, which you'd think would be a good problem. It's certainly more healthy, but sometimes instead of fruit I just want a big old chicken parm hero. To be fair, a lot of this is probably more to do with my own personal neurosis. I feel embarrassed when lurking in European subreddits where you see jokes at the expense of an Irish American or an Italian American. Someone uses a DNA kit, sees they struck 6% Scandinavian, and suddenly they are asking Facebook groups to run genealogical surveys to prove their connection to Ragnar the Red. It's hypocritical of me to enjoy these kind of jokes, regardless of how I've clad myself in self-aware armor. Too bad it's the ramshackle hand-me-down. Such a rusty piece of kit should be more than enough to protect me from cringing, right? Nah, truth be told, I'm exactly the kind of person to get excited about little tidbits of family history. From another perspective, however, these kinds of claims are, in a sense, a historical continuation of a culture, a time, a place. These can be seen like copies of a snapshot that has been scanned onto a computer, distorted by pixelation as more and more time passes and further compression muddles the original photo. The more and more it's copied poorly. Examining the idea from a more charitable aspect, that all this talk of heritage, demographics, genealogy, which almost borders on nostalgia, helps me see the whole of my unsettled relationship with the past in a positive light. Looking at it this way, I'm more than happy to immerse myself in figuring it out without the cynicism. Being jaded gets boring after a while anyway. Being jaded, it turns out, is the easiest thing to do because you really don't have to do much. Digging into the story, doing research, watching videos, and listening to first-hand accounts were great, but it wasn't enough. I had to put Norway theory to test. I had to stick myself into Oslo's tourist traps and alleyways to capture an impression of the city, a proper one even. Moreover, I had to do this all during the end of November, just when the country was starting to get colder. If I couldn't handle the city during a cold snap, I thought, then I didn't deserve to keep harping on the Scandinavians. Unfortunately for the Norwegians, the weather proved to be agreeable enough for this bumbling Brooklyn boy. Let's talk about some of the aesthetic similarities between both cities. Both places are built around natural harbors that are bustling with commercial shipping and ferries. Fishing used to be an important part of South Brooklyn business, but we're far, far away from those days. Fishing is still an active business and hobby in Oslo today. Norwegian immigrants coming to Brooklyn in the early 1900s might have found that the shoreline and many docks along Narrows Bay to be very familiar to home. The salt-tinged air sells that atmosphere as well. Meanwhile, the things about the Norwegian capital city that impressed me were during the many walks I took along Akerselva, or is it Akersliva? A thin but vivacious river that danced along the city's eastern side, complete with throngs of ducks, cute stone-cut bridges, and even a small waterfall shown earlier in the video. Both Oslo and Brooklyn can be expensive, but one invites while the other dangles a prospect of entertainment behind a paywall. There are opportunities to experience a lot in Brooklyn, but so much has been sought out and filtered through a veneer of slime and hostility. But it's not all doom and gloom. Both places are very forward-looking in terms of food. Oswegians are just as crazy about ethnic cuisine as we Brooklynites are. The meme is that in Norway all you'll find is salted fish and potatoes, which is demonstrably false. Not that I dislike salty fish and potatoes, mind you. You'll instead find plenty of variety. And a follow-up video might be on food found up on the Northern Way. And don't get me started on how seriously Oslovians take their coffee. Eating out in Oslo is more costly than South Brooklyn, but it feels comparable to pricing that one would see in Manhattan. It's said that Norwegians and the people of Oslo are among the richest in the world, or was that Bergen? Yes, dining out at your standard restaurant will teach you the meaning of cost, and a little bit of humility. Where you do feel the largest sting is liquor, in which a specialized tax is in effect that raises the price noticeably compared to American liquor prices. All of this is thanks to this governmental body that handles all liquor sales called Vinmonopolet. So while I can see people from rural Middle America balking at the pricing, it's really more or less similar to any core northeastern city. And I'm not sure if this is a bonus or a plus, since that means that we at home are in a Stockholm Syndrome grip with the prices. We're trapped into expensive entertainment and libations. But hey, at least I won't get culture shock from Oslanded restaurant receipts. All of this is juxtaposed with Gothic churches that brush up against the cutting edge of modern office and civic buildings. All of it looks expensive and aggressively contemporary, yet considered around human distances. Regardless of all this investment, you'll find a lot of graffiti around town in surprising places, even on very new architecture. Some of it does look more like artistic and somewhat pretentious murals like you'll find in the hipster areas of Brooklyn, but a lot really seems pushed from an authentic place. So that means that a lot of it is crass, trashy, and loaded with political meaning. But I can't deny that I find this kind of expression to have a certain grungy charm. Maybe it's a little bit more of that home life seeping into where I travel abroad. I know that graffiti is supposed to be a mark of rougher areas, and I'm sure some of the locals would have you believe that these areas are, in fact, rough and rife with crime. This kind of lived-in and colorful urban landscape, however, gave me the strongest sense of certain streets in Brooklyn. I would know, just because a place looks a little dicey and it isn't completely sanitized, doesn't mean the people living there are any less helpful or lively or even nice. These seasoned areas of the city are flanked by posh shopping streets and an abundance of cultural institutions. Pick a direction and you're likely to come across a museum or an art installation. It's legitimately overwhelming, and I don't see how anyone can coherently rush through this town in a couple of days with any kind of sense for these collections. From what I experienced in Oslo, most of the city's parks feature some form of artwork or sculpture, which is a lot harder to find in Brooklyn, though not impossible. I would say that this all emphasizes Oslo's resolve to renovate public spaces, and always in a way that's more than just functional. The city is extremely concerned with its aesthetics. The city is also concerned with having nature around. It's all accessible. A relatively quick metro ride or walk from Centrum puts you in connection with Ekbergparken. It's a park that offers a light hike with scenic overviews of Oslo Fjord. Directly south from Centrum lays the knife point of the fjord itself, and one can swim in that cold water if they want. Imagine that. It's close enough to an office in downtown that one could take a quick dip during lunch if they were motivated enough. It's a cornucopia of nature, and it offers robust hiking strewn about all the hills of the city. And if that's not enough for you, there's a ski jump and a vast forest just a metro ride away. Truth be told, I'm not a postmodern art kind of guy. Expressionism, yes! but having these green spaces filled with both contemporary and historical art gave me a new appreciation for its presentation in nature. Maybe I'll have to give the MoMA another chance. Spoilers, he didn't. VikingFest is an annual party that happens in Owl's Head Park, an old Bay Ridge staple with splendid views of the Narrows. It's no Eckeberg-parken, but it's the closest thing to resembling a hill that we have in these parts. In the winter, if the park is lucky enough to get snow that sticks, you can imagine that the hilltop is a perfect little bunny slope to get your urban skiing on. The festival itself is a humble affair these days, like anything else to do with the Scandinavian rearguard. Recently, the fair celebrated its 20th year anniversary, placing the inception of VikingFest somewhere at the turn of the millennium, far removed from the glory days of the Enclave. You might think of the whole fair as a celebratory version of not going gentle into that good night. Most of the attendants would likely be former Bay Ridge residents, pre-gaming in anticipation for the Syttende Mai, May 17th, parade. Some of the activities have a stapled-together feel in an effort to keep the fires burning and the memory alive. It's difficult to shake the feeling of witnessing a cultural last stand. It would be easy to dismiss this as dumpy or misguided. But that's just wrong. There's so much more charm and can-do spirit during the festival. You can find imported Norwegian goods and candy. Plus, having a Viking-style longship that is seaworthy is impressive. Forget the fact that the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo is closed for renovations. I'm not salty about it. I have this cool ship to look at right here. Add a point to the Brooklyn tally, please. You can feel the passion and pride that the few remaining Brooklyn Norwegian holdouts bring to the table. Here, a generational remnant working with their limited free time passes the torch forward, sometimes to their children, sometimes to the new groups now living in Bay Ridge, and sometimes to nerds like myself. Old traditions are remixed and made palatable to a New York audience, all in the effort of keeping the memory alive. Both the organizers and revelers are proud of their history and are entirely enthusiastic in a way that's infectious. What comes across is the heart and pluckiness of the proceedings, and I can only hope that the event can continue to enjoy sunny days and homemade waffles for as long as possible. In celebrating May 17th, Norwegians and Americans have a commonality, a gusto of nationalistic pride. Although the circumstances of Constitution Day are quite different, it would not be unfair to compare the intensity of the celebration to July the 4th in America. Flags are out and waving, parades are the rule and not the exception, and of course there's a copious amount of imbibing. As far as I can tell, the other Scandinavian countries don't have a bombastic party on the scale that the Norwegians do. Asking other Swedish people about Syttende Mai has them politely responding that such nationalism is somewhat tacky or silly or even racist. I haven't had the pleasure of asking the Danes what they think about their quote-unquote little brothers to the north, or their happy day of cultural dress and dancing. Personally, I would like to believe that the commonality between Norway and America here is that both countries were, in essence, a colony that made efforts to be independent. Colony isn't the right word, at least in the Scandinavian sense. It's more like one nation being under the guidance or thumb of another one. On the one hand, you have the relationship between the US and the UK. On the other hand, we have the relationship between Norway, with Sweden and Denmark taking turns between them. When it came to independence, the method that both nations took couldn't be any more different, but the results in self-determination are, well, self-evident. At this juncture in history, most of the extant Norwegian population in America is located around the states of Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and Wisconsin. I can only assume that most inhabitants of the gutted Lobscouse enclave decided to spread out to other parts of the US. There's a great video on the Norwegian Americans that have grown to be a core part of the Midwest's identity. In the video, two travelers from Norway partake in a road trip that thoroughly explores that area. and I highly recommend the video if you're interested in hearing about that half of the story. There is, however, no mention of the Norwegian enclave in Brooklyn, and I don't mean that as a form of criticism to that video. No, what it does help illustrate is that the history of the Brooklyn Norwegian is so much more downplayed, and it's legitimately a challenge to verify or find records of their passing, besides the telltale marks left on South Brooklyn itself, kinda like the Leif Erikson Park stone, which is a replica of a runestone found in Norway. It was even dedicated in 1939 by the Crown Prince Olav. Pretty neat that he took the time to come on over. Also, what's the deal with cars for every Bay Ridge parade? Is all this just American grandstanding, saber rattling, and cultural appropriating? Well, no. This is as real a celebration as it gets, with the Royal Norwegian Consulate General of New York, mouthful, declaring their support of the event. Quote, "It's a day filled with nostalgia. The celebration on May 17th is a testament to the values of freedom and independence. These fundamental principles form a strong bond between our two nations, deeply respected and cherished by both Norwegians and Americans." Unquote. Bay Ridge is far removed from the Norwegian crowds of yesteryear, more than 7 decades ago. The crowd in attendance has become far more diverse in those 70 years. And regardless of the diminished scale of festivities, there is a lot of love in the event, enough that people travel from all over America to partake in the parade. Multiple lodges come from around the Northeast to proudly wave their banners. Shout out to the Yoa Sporting Club for being so amazing. There were even a few groups from Norway itself who were able to manage a visit to Brooklyn since our parade took place on May 19th. Maybe they were around to keep the Americans honest? Or maybe it's important to simply go to where the joy is and celebrate. Besides, this is all a tiny piece of the complete puzzle that is history. I won't even get into how Oslo is only a small representative piece of Norway, much like how New York is a representative piece of America, though not its entirety. My retelling of events of the Scandinavian experience in South Brooklyn fails to include the enclaves of Swedish and Finnish immigrants that also called the place home. And while I would be interested in looking into that history, this video is focusing on Norway, because we already hear about Finns and Swedes all the time. It's about Norway for once. And this has nothing to do with the fact that I got a camera and finally decided to look or take trips to Norway. Because what could be better than hiking up trails very slowly while sweating out gallons of corn syrup, all the while you're breathless and dizzy because you're cultivating a growing snooze habit. And who knows, maybe you join a metal band while you're there, maybe you join a protest while you're there. I don't judge. I know when most people think of Norway, they think of fjords and nature, and sure, what I saw of that did seem very special. But what most impressed upon me and stays in my memory was the hustle of the nation's capital, the grime and modernizing aspects of the city, the music and culture. In the future, I'd like to return back to the Tiger City, or Tigerstaden, and delve more deeply into its history and design while getting more footage of its districts. There were a lot of music venues and breweries within the city that I missed. And even though I was there for a couple of weeks, I feel as though I've barely scratched the surface of what Oslo has to showcase. I think I'm starting to romanticize Oslo. I haven't even finished exploring what Brooklyn has on tap. To take an excerpt from Knut Hamsun's book Hunger, quote, "Christiania, that strange city that no one escapes from until it's left its mark upon him." This video isn't a call to action, but an attempt to relish and linger in the resonance of the past. These are the last vestiges of a time soon to be lost, forgotten, but like the ghosts in the stories, resurface when conditions are right. Look away for too long and it all melts apart into the background. One day it never returns, which can make it seem like nothing matters. This doesn't make anything pointless. Rather, it's in these temporary grievances that let us glimpse into the beauty of this world. It cycles, looping endlessly, repeating with new families and new stories. And I know for a fact this doesn't apply to only Brooklyn history or Oslo history. It's not exclusive to Norway theory. It carries on with innumerable cultures, places, and history. Maybe that's a really trite observation. I truly hope so. I hope it's something that we all note around us, and infuses us with curiosity and compassion about our world. We live tumultuous lives sometimes, and if we don't bother to mark and remember them, who will? These are what our stories are made of. I'm thankful I saw this version of the story, and for now, however poorly, however sincerely, however enthusiastically, I'm glad I got to share it with you. Thanks for watching.